So I'm going to do a general introduction to Liu Shiming and his life and work. And I think, first of all, this is Liu Shiming. And if you look at those life dates, you may realize that we're in for a journey, if you know anything about recent Chinese history. I think of Liu Shiming as a man who tried to live a simple life, completely dedicated to art, in a very dramatically complicated political era. And this is something that he had to deal with at every step of his career. I like to think of artists as being situated in three ways. Situated personally, situated socially, and situated historically. Hi, Leo. In Liu Shiming's case, he had a very distinct personality, somewhat eccentric, very independent, and he had a mild, progressively worse muscular disability. So as the years went by, he became less and less able to walk on his own. Ironically, his father, there on the left, was a star soccer player in high school and college. Later went off to study in the United States for 4 years when Liu Shiming was between 1 and 4 years old. Consequently, Liu Shiming bonded much more intimately with his mother, seen on the right, and in fact could never quite call his father dad, even many years later. There were 7 children altogether, 3 of whom had that muscular deterioration. And because of their father's work as a mechanical engineer on the railroad, they lived a fairly comfortable middle-class life in the city of Tianjin. Tianjin is a port city about 75 miles from Beijing. Beijing is landlocked. So most of the trade, most of the goods in those days that went to Beijing came through Tianjin. Now, historically, I'm going to step back a ways. A good friend of mine, the critic and scholar Christopher Phillips, told me when I first went to China, I said, what should I not miss? And he said, I know this is going to sound corny, but you must go to the Forbidden City. If you want to understand China, you have to start there. The very name tells you a great deal about the nature of governance in China for approximately 1,100 years, when it was an empire with an emperor. This was the emperor's residence in Beijing, and as you can see, it's a series of courtyards, interlocking courtyards, becoming more and more exclusive as you progressed, becoming closer and closer to the presence of the emperor. And by the same token, power and rule emanated from the center of the Forbidden City outward. And oddly enough, even today, there's an echo of that. A lot of cities in the United States, when they get very big, and they proudly say, we're so big we have a ring road, so that people can get access. Well, Beijing has 7 ring roads, 5 of them in the city proper and 2 outward. And you can see, again, that sense of the concentric, the emanation from the center, and also the sense of exclusion, famously the Great Wall of China. China chose to be a land empire, not a sea empire. And this is the kind of work that you would see traditionally in China, historically, in palaces and temples. These are like, guardian lions, again, protecting. And China itself was originally called the Middle Kingdom because during the period of the Warring States, the Qin state was at the center and then took over all the others. But before long, this sense of Middle Kingdom came to mean the center of the world. And then the name was even modified to become the Celestial Kingdom. And there was this notion that there was not only a physical kingdom here on earth, but that it sort of hovered halfway between our earthly existence and heaven itself. And of course, the emperor was the intermediary between the forces of the cosmos and everyday life in the world. And the emperor operated with something called the mandate of heaven. So as long as things were going well, it was assumed that the emperor had the mandate of heaven. If things started to go wrong, civil unrest or natural disasters, people began to suspect that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. And that could lead to all sorts of trouble, as you can imagine. So here's just more examples, dragon guardian figures. The tortoise representing long life, the crane, good fortune. And let us not forget that at this time, Chinese culture was highly religious. There was, first of all, folk religion. You can still find in temples in China, shrines to the local god, the town god. And then you had Taoism, and you had Buddhism, and you had Islam, and you had Christianity coming in various waves, all of whom had their own sculptural tradition, as you can see here in these figures. So I often think of China as this kind of flower that progressively over time would open and close. For example, in the 15th century, there was an admiral, Zheng He, who commanded the largest wooden ships ever made. And they were packed with soldiers and packed with storage capacity for trade. And he was able to go all the way to India, to Arabia, to Africa. But the Ming emperor decided, you know what? The port cities are becoming too strong, too important, and they're bringing in too much foreign influence. So the Ming emperor limited the size of ships that could be built. And he commanded then a land empire. Well, that was all good and well for a while, until they came up against the British, which was a maritime empire. So the British come sailing into China with their warships, and they essentially launched something called the Opium Wars. Now, I don't know about you, when I used to hear the term Opium Wars, I assumed it was like, cocaine gangs fighting over territory. Not at all. The British Empire had a trade imbalance. Lots of people wanted porcelain and silk from China. Not so many people in China wanted wool from, northern England. So they said, what can we come up with that the Chinese might want? Well, we've got all these poppy fields in India. So the British government, acting through a private company called, sent their warships to guarantee that bales of opium could be unloaded in Chinese ports and distributed. The Chinese fought back, but to no avail, and the British persevered. And people were very conscious of it, even at the time, of what was happening. And the results, as you can imagine, were both a physical and a moral debilitation of the Chinese population. And this period following is often referred to as the century of humiliations, because these foreign powers came in. And here, for example, is the town that Liu Shiming grew up in. The very center of the town is divided into 8 districts by 8 foreign countries. Now you have to imagine this in our terms. Imagine that China sent warships into New York Harbor to unload fentanyl and then turned over 8 neighborhoods to 8 different Asian countries. So, Union Square area is controlled by Korea, Greenwich Village is controlled by China, Tribeca is controlled by Japan. That was literally the situation in many key Chinese cities at that time. As you can imagine, it led to resistance, most famously the Boxer Rebellion around 1900, which was quickly put down. And then began a long period of convulsion, lasting essentially 22 years, from 1927 to 1949. So you had a civil war between the nationalists and communists within China itself, and then in the middle of it, Japan invaded. So you have civil war, then they sort of get together to resist Japan. Japan is defeated, then they go back to fighting each other in the second half of the Civil War. That invasion, the Second World War in China, is referred to as the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, for very good reasons. The loss of life is very hard to grasp. Our Civil War, the American Civil War, and our losses in World War II, if you total up both of those, it comes to just over 1 million casualties, deaths, 1.1 million. In this period in China, the deaths were 13 million. So Mao, even when he was in retreat in the mountains and caves of Yan'an, was already planning what society would be like when he came to power. And one of the things he addressed was art and literature, and he gave a famous series of addresses on this topic. And he said that he wanted an army of artists and writers. That is, they would have the same kind of role as a soldier to further the cause of communism. And the heroes of their art and of their literature should be workers, peasants, and soldiers. So when he finally did come to power in 1949, he instituted socialist realism throughout China, which meant the only kind of art that was allowed to be made and shown in China was socialist realism, which sort of has 2 faces. One, here we have Mao, now in the place of the emperor. This is the gate of heavenly peace. So you're standing in Tiananmen Square looking in to what would be the entrance to the Forbidden City, and with Mao's portrait presiding over it. So socialist realism had 2 aspects. One was, of course, to point out the evils of the past. This is a very famous piece called The Rent Collection Courtyard, which shows an exploitive landlord demanding grain and tax from his peasants. And poor peasants having to lug their tax payment to the landlord, and mothers being torn from their children when they couldn't pay their taxes, that sort of thing. And the other side of it, of course, was the heroic side the workers, peasants, and soldiers marching forward into the utopian future of socialism under Mao, as you see at the very top there. In the midst of this, Liu Shiming goes to the Central Academy of Fine Art in Beijing. And as you can see, the students look very normal. I mean, it's essentially middle-class kids, as you would see in an art school anywhere, anytime. And many of their teachers had studied abroad. In the 18th century, there was an Italian monk who came to China and stayed for 50 years, and was very close to the emperor, and he introduced Western-style art and spurred an interest in it. And at the turn of the 20th century, many, many Chinese artists went abroad, particularly to France. And so many of Liu Shiming's teachers, and he, by the way, is there standing on the right between two young ladies, if you recognize him from the previous photo. So his very first work, as he's finishing school, is called Measuring the Land, and this celebrates the redistribution process. In the past, almost all of the land was owned by a very small number of landlords, a relatively small number of landlords. And Mao instituted this policy of redistributing the land to the peasants, which of course made them quite happy, briefly. Liu Shiming and his fellow students were required to go out to the countryside and observe this. And then he came back and made this work, which has many of the qualities of his much later work. These sort of humble figures, very well animated and without being highly detailed. And it seems to emanate sympathy for the policy and what's going on, largely because neither he nor anyone else at that time was fully aware of what was happening. If you redistribute the land, what becomes of the landlords? Well, they get put in front of kangaroo courts. Their former peasants, goaded and pushed on by the hardcore cadres, would insult them and tell all of the terrible things that they had done over the years, and very often they would be executed. The estimate is that 1.5 million former landlords were executed at this time. One of his works from like a year or two later, or I guess it's the same year, sorry, is this, a Korean woman, obviously a soldier with a baby on her back. And the reason for this interest was that the Korean War had begun. And as you can see, North Korea is adjacent to China. And the distance between Beijing and the capital of North Korea is only 500 miles. And the American fleet, is in the straits between China and Taiwan, and the American army is moving into South Korea. So China felt its territorial integrity was threatened, and they sent 277,000 Chinese soldiers to North Korea. They were called volunteer soldiers, I'm not sure why. So this is another monument that Liu Shiming designed with the volunteer soldier. I just wanted to back up and show you that. This resonates very well with Mao's notion that women hold up half the sky. He was very proud of, in theory, treating women equally and giving them equal responsibility in the new society, including combat responsibility. Of course, the reality of war is quite different. Then after he finished 1 year graduate school, Liu Shiming was put on what was called the Sculpture Factory team. I don't know if Andy Warhol knew about the Sculpture Factory, but this was a team of sculptors who did monumental socialist realist work. And one of the first projects that he worked on was the Monument to People's Heroes in Tiananmen Square, and he worked specifically on this panel, which is an odd one. Well, all the other panels kind of make sense. They commemorate earlier uprisings against corrupt landlords, evil emperors, what have you. This one commemorates the Taiping uprising. It's called Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The Taiping rebellion took place essentially at the same time as the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. And the insurrection was led by a fellow who had convinced himself that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. And he marshaled a huge number of people under his cause. So one of the things that's peculiar is this is Mao, essentially, because endorsing a rebellion simply because it's a rebellion. And this is very much part of the Mao paradigm. Even though his doctrine is atheistic, based on Marxism, nevertheless, he commemorates an uprising which was all about Christianity. It's mysterious to me, like nobody knows about the Taiping Rebellion, right? Whoever heard of that? The death toll in the Taiping Rebellion was at least 20 million people. Some of the estimates go as high as 100 million, if you count in the famines that were induced by So here's Liu Shiming on the right, sitting with the large-scale maquette as opposed to the smaller maquette for a work called Cutting Through the Mountains to Bring in Water. And this celebrates many of the infrastructure projects that were undertaken after the liberation in 1949. China got a huge loan from the Soviet Union and undertook the building of dams, factories, what have you. And here you see a version of it scaled up and installed. And one of the things to notice is how different it is. If you look at the figure, it's not the same position. And the kind of polychrome treatment, of course, changes it. And Liu Shiming wasn't very happy about this. And at one point, he went in to the workshop and put his name on the base of the model for the sculpture. This was discovered, and then he was forced to add the names of all the other sculptors who worked on the project. Which, in a funny way, reminds me of something. Okay, the Western tradition of, observation of anatomy, etc., which you certainly see in a work like this, but also this. I'm sure Pepe knows about this, with a few other people in the audience. You see that sash going across the chest of the Blessed Virgin Mary? This is what it says. Michelangelo, I can't say his last name, Florentine made this. Now, it's one thing to sign a painting or to sign a sculpture on the base, but to put this on the sash across the chest of the Virgin Mary, right? Is a very bold act. I don't think we know exactly why Michelangelo did it, We know why Liu Shiming signed his, because he wanted credit for his creation. So time goes on, and he continues to work on these projects. We're about to come up to a point where he leaves Beijing. And it would be very nice, it would make a terrific story if we could say, all right, he did these socialist realist works in the beginning, and then he did an about-face, and he went off to the provinces, and he made only his own work from his own heart. That's not exactly the case. When he left Beijing, he went to Henan province and later to Hubei for a total of something like 14 years. While he was there, he continued to work on socialist realist projects and to teach here and there. Self-explanatory, I believe. So you had then essentially a decade of the 80s when China is opening up. Mao has died. Deng Xiaoping has instituted a form of sort of controlled capitalism. Foreign books, foreign films, foreign people are once again allowed to enter China. And at the end of that decade, there was a show called China Avant-Garde at the same museum, the National Museum, with the theme, no U-turn, essentially no going back, right? We're forging on into the future to be like every other developed nation in the 20th and 21st century. Didn't go that smoothly. This exhibition was closed down when one of the artists took out a pistol and fired 2 shots at her own work. I think the same thing would happen in any museum here, even today, if an artist did that. But it was taken by the artists as a kind of sign of the limit that they could go to, and the point beyond which they could not go. And this takes place in February, and 4 months later, you have Tiananmen Square with, in a way, the most famous figurative sculpture in modern Chinese history, the goddess of liberty, which was made by CAFA students and paraded through Tiananmen Square before the slaughter. So after Tiananmen Square, there's a crackdown, and experimental artists go into retreat. Many of them live in what was called the East Village, which is this very dumpy part of Beijing. And many of them did performances, a lot of nude performances, as if all they had to work with were their own bodies, in a sense. And here you see them, piling on top of each other in order to extend the height of this mountain, a very symbolic gesture. Performance that could be interpreted as figurative sculpture as well, I suppose. But when things began to loosen up yet again, many artists dealt with this clash, this confrontation between the socialist past and what seemed to be the semi-capitalist future. So, this is a very famous series of paintings where you have, the worker, peasant, soldier with the old political gesture, but now they're endorsing Coca-Cola. This is by the same artist. These look like they could fit into any socialist realist scenario, except they're made entirely tongue-in-cheek and a kind of mockery of what came before. And here you have things like empty Mao suits, which again sort of speak for themselves. Or people laughing in a way that's not really so funny. And then you have, wildly experimental things like Sai Cheng's work with explosives. And some of those works, were done not only in the sky, but he would do them on the floor with canvas and create what looked like paintings. And those things here you see in the background. And I'm showing these glamorous ladies because of the tremendous social change that had taken place in China in these years. Pepe and I have talked about this at one point. In those few years, probably more people were lifted out of poverty than at any time in human history. And it was done not through pure socialism and not through pure capitalism, but through state-controlled capitalism, interestingly. I'm not an economist, so I won't get into that debate. But by this point, you have all of the major fashion brands of the world descending on China, putting on fashion shows, opening glamorous boutiques. And this is Shanghai. I'm a country boy. I grew up with images of the Cultural Revolution and people in Mao suits, and bread lines and whatnot. I land in Shanghai and it looks like this. And this is an interesting shot because in the foreground, you have the old Bund, which was lined with colonial commercial establishments from the old days when, there were concessions in Shanghai as there were in Tianjin. And on the other side of the river, you have the rising of the new China in Pudong. And all along the Bund, you have these very glamorous bars, Red Bar and 3 on the Bund, and New Heights, and a bar actually called the Glamour Bar. So it was a real go-go period. And one could well argue that, Liu Shiming at this point was missing the boat. I mean, that it's work like this, done much earlier, which in its oddness and complexity better expresses the contemporary experience than what Liu Shiming was doing. But I want to argue that what he was doing was perfectly legitimate and in some ways not so different as you might think. And this is where we come to the pop quiz. I invite you, you don't have to close your eyes if you don't want, but and see if you can, when I put out these names, summon up an image of their work, okay? Brancusi, Giacometti, Calder, Henry Moore, Richard Serra. Everybody get 100%? Okay, what does that tell us? The fact that we're all able to do that indicates that at some point in their career, these artists developed a signature look, almost a brand look. And we can all spot, a Giacometti from 50 yards away. So in a way, that is not so different from what Liu Shiming was doing. He found his style, he found his subject matter, and he stayed with it. Not such a terrible thing to do, in my estimation. And at least he didn't fall into this trap. Now here's, again, a Smith sculpture enshrined in MoMA. But it very easily slides into things like this, which you can now find all over China. And this is made-to-order abstraction. There's like a catalog, and you can choose one of 3 sizes, and you wait 2 months, and it's delivered. At least he didn't do that. I call this sort of anodyne abstraction. And it's one of the things that's used to avoid the danger of possible political commentary in the China of today. So I'd like to go back to what Liu Shiming actually did, and this is a very good example, I think. this piece called Mother, Home. And note the equivalence. Home and mother are the same to him. And within this little circle, what you have is, in the foreground, two lovers. And then a kind of barrier, but the barrier has a hole in it, almost like a broken hymen. And on the other side is a mother with child. And interestingly, the mother and child is much larger, much more prominent than the lovers. And I think that kind of love, maternal love, meant much more to Liu Shiming than its sexual prelude. And I think then we should leave him to his work. Here he is with the crutches almost representing his limitations that we all have of some sort, but working intently and staring intently and looking out, looking at the other and trying to understand the other and express the other. And I would submit that this is the true art of the people, not socialist realism. So with that, I'd say thank you.
That was great, Richard. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And does anybody have any questions that they'd like to? I guess you covered everything. Anyway, thank you so much for being here. And please look around the gallery, look at the work, and ask any of us. If you have any questions, just come up and ask. And we're delighted to have you here. Thank you.